Lord, you truly paid it all for us. It's my prayer that we would grow into the full stature of Christ, that we would have your mind. There's a lot to be gleaned from that presentation in Portugal about having your mind. May we truly desire in our heart to be the living sacrifice and not be afraid to be among those that do things that we know to be wrong, but that we might be drawn to those that you would have us to minister to. Let us not be so rigid that we would not go when the calling comes. May your love be reflected in us in all that we do, in all that we say, always, that people will see you in us and they want to come and be with you. We thank you for the blessing and the privilege of being here, for the opportunity to be a part of this great work. And as we continue reviewing past material, may you help us to catch the points we've missed. I know I missed many. And that we might have continued growth and understanding of what it is that you are doing. That we can be a part of your right arm. That we might bring glory and honor to thy name. So bless us in our next study here as we review the 3 steps of restoration. We thank you and we praise you and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I think you can see the screen, right?
Yes, we see it.
Dogs are restless. I hope they hold out. Okay, so this was March of 2021. It's the 3 steps of restoration. Oops, I don't think I meant to close that. Sorry, guys. Okay, I think I had my mouse in the wrong place. Okay. So this was Elder Tess, so we know it's not me speaking. She didn't have one set of subject matter in this particular presentation unless you want to make it really broad. Instead, there are issues and questions that have been arising, and that some of the questions have been around for a while. But especially from the Brazilian camp meeting to now. This was March, remember? So she wanted to address some of what she thinks are misunderstandings that we have in this movement. And there were 3 particular issues that she addressed here. And she goes through and does not have time to get to all 3. So we want to look at our study of equality. It was laid out in August 2019 as a history that takes us from Eden to Eden. And now after Eden, there was sin, and it was the sin of Eve here. So there was this first sin where her and her husband separated and Eve took of the fruit. So we have sin 1 up here. And with this sin, there was the result of this curse. And what was that curse? What curse came with the first sin?
Inequality?
Gender inequality.
Anybody else?
Or
No,
sexism.
that either.
Sexism, any of those.
Yeah, sexism. The submission of women and sexism. And it's described as a curse. Then we come down to the sin of Ham. So we have Eve, and then we have Ham and his sin. And his sin, we see, results in racism, nationalism. And we went through that, a pretty good discussion last week, or I think it was last week or the week before, when we talked about Noah and how it actually, and then listening to Brendan's presentation and how it actually resulted in racism. It's described as a curse, not a curse as we would understand a curse. It's just stating what will inevitably come as a result of his actions, and that was racism. So it was a cause and effect. The actions brought the effect, and the effect was racism. So do we understand how chiasms work? Let's look at a Bible verse that is a classic chiasm. The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So can we see the chiasm? What's the chiasm in that? Anybody see the chiasm?
Sabbath man, man Sabbath.
Right. A, Sabbath man, man Sabbath. So it's like a mirror. When you hold up a mirror and it gives an exact replica of what you look like, but it switches from left to right, so it's reverse. If you were to look out for a sentence that is a chiasm, you could find these chiasms where they are exact, where the words work word by word inside. And that's not what we're dealing with here. You couldn't read this sentence backwards. The example that we're using, so this was a phrase, the Sabbath was a phrase, and man was a phrase, and then this was a phrase, and then this was a phrase. So you couldn't actually read it backwards. But the sentence is constructed as a mirror image, where the same theme is repeated at the very beginning and then the very end. So Sabbath and Sabbath at the beginning and the end. And these middle concepts are the same. So you have Sabbath, or take the arrow there, beginning and end, and then in the middle, it's man and man. Why is she pointing that out? Anybody?
To simplify restoration.
Yeah. Take that a little further.
And from the beginning.
Yeah. So Jesus is stating a simple fact, but this is just an example of a type of structure. It's part of our methodology. Because if you ever watched Elder Parmenter, particularly going back a few years, his presentations on methodology, understanding this methodology enables us to go into not simple, but complex verses and understand through the structure what is being taught. So if you had a verse where this last part was not clear, this part was not clear, you know the intention of the phrase because the structure of the sentence will indicate that this is just a repeat of the beginning. So if you didn't have this last part, you would be able to understand it. So we deliberately looked at a simple verse, but especially more complex verses, understanding chiasm becomes powerful. And we've done that some with some of our study. It's being able to fill in the things that are missing, or putting it on a balance and being able to put in the things that are missing by understanding these structures, which opens up the Bible in more light. If I was to do this, we started with Eden here, and we ended with Eden. Started at one place and end at the same place, instead of this journey being where you start at point A, so this is point A, and then you end at point B. We start at point A and we end at point A, Eden to Eden. We started at A and we end at A. So we have stretched this on one line, one history up here, Eden to Eden, because it's time or it's linear. But you could just as well take that line and bend it, like here, because we're returning to the same place, Eden to Eden. So we're going to bend that line. So our entire history is working like a chiasm. This was their path away from God. So this is the path away from God. And then this is our path back to God. This was degeneration of humanity, and this is the restoration of humanity. Degeneration and the restoration. So our steps through degeneration, just like a chiasm, we're going to repeat those same steps. But like a chiasm, it's a mirror image. So our first step of regeneration, what is it going to be about? What's the first step of regeneration going to be? If it's a mirror image, right? Only it's going to be the opposite on this side. What does restoration begin with?
The first step will be the last, right?
Right,
Racism.
racism.
Yeah.
So the first step of regeneration is racism. So if we were to say sexism, we're working like this: sexism, racism. We would be saying sexism, racism, sexism, racism. And is that a chiasm? No. That would be saying Sabbath man, Sabbath man. We could argue it's a repeat and enlarge, but it's not a chiasm. A chiasm is like this. If this is a return journey, you may see waymarks along the journey. So if you're going to go on a walk in nature, you're going to take a trail and you're going to turn around and come back that same trail. You're going to pass everything in reverse, if that makes sense. And the end will actually be the beginning of your journey. So waymark 1, you have waymark 1, and then waymark 2, and this is degeneration, and then you're going to return. This will be restoration. So what's the first point that you come across in the return journey? And you guys just got it. Is a 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah.
And it's 3. So it goes down 3, 2, 1. Racism. So you put racism up here would be the first one. So if we're going to be restored towards Eden, this is the degeneration, and now we're going towards Eden. We're going to be restored towards Eden. You see waymark 3 turn around and pass over the ground of waymark 3. So you see it you turn around and you're going back over that same ground, going back over racism again. So now remember, this story is a chiasm. So this story is repeated here. And what happened before the flood? What went wrong? And why did the flood come? This history in here before the flood.
Inequality and oppression.
So the sin before the flood, he's going to take his people from a populated country. There's sin. And he's going to take them from the sea in the ark to the land. And once they reach that land, the first issue they're going to face is one of racism or nationalism. So when does the restoration start? What is the sin that makes God say, I'm done with this land and we need a new one?
Persecution.
Oops, we missed a line, sorry. I don't think I meant for that to happen. Yeah, he's going to take his people from what to what. And going to build them an ark. That was not supposed to do that. I don't know why that did that. I hope it's not like that the rest of the way. Build them an ark and take them from sea to dry land and make a new start in a desolate continent. So sin before the flood. He's going to take a people from a populated country, sea to land. Okay. And so what is the sin that makes God say, I'm done with this land? And here you have, it was the 1260 years of church and state is the sin. So we would have known that the sin that caused the flood was not the same type of was not some type of sexual revolution. So when we look at this sin, I don't think the question was clear that she's talking about this area here. She's talking about the sin before the flood. But when you look at the 1260, it'll tell us that we shouldn't be expecting it to be some type of sexual revolution. The sin that caused the flood was the same sin that you would have observed in the 1260. It wasn't the idea of rampant immorality in this history, or with the Protestant idea of immorality. That was instituted in the 1260. Sin needs a new start in a desolate land. Prophetically, they went from sea to land. The sea, the multitudes of Europe in this history, to the land, the United States. So here they went from sea to land, the ark, to a new land. And from here, they went from the nations of the multitudes of Europe to the United States, a lamb-like beast. So what is the first issue that the new country has to address? And we've already answered that. The first issue that has to be addressed is racism. So you go from degeneration to restoration. And the path towards that restoration began with the time of the end in 1798, where God takes a people and he brings them back to himself. If we were to work our way inwards, Eden to Eden, come inwards, okay? Eden to Eden, we walk with God, and we'll walk with God after the second advent. I'm hoping we can see it. We walked with God. Sin came, brought pain and degeneration to us physically, and we began to fall away from him. We are restored to him before we get a new body, physical restoration. We walk with him, and then we are given Eden. The degeneration and restoration works perfectly like a chiasm. And that last sin that brought that last curse in the life of Noah is the very first step that God has to take to restore us. Does everybody follow that then? That the sin here was not rampant immorality, sexual immorality. It's the same sin as here, this union of church and state. Sorry, I said that wrong. But looking at this history here helps us to understand this history here. It was this nationalism and racism. Plus, when we looked at understanding what Ham actually did, when we looked at the sin, talked about the sin of Ham and how that resulted in what it did. So it has to be undone. And so God has to take steps. God has to take these are steps that God has to take to restore us. And the first one is to teach us about racism. And going on that Portugal class, go back and mentioning that Portugal class, if everybody watch, those that choose to watch it during the week, and seeing that God was going to return here. And he points out in there how Ellen White was not advocating for like whites to be married, whites and blacks being married together and such. So she was not advocating those things. So somehow, some way, God is going to correct that when they go to heaven, if that makes sense. So sin, the 1260, the earth swallows up the flood and the curse is dealt with. So you have sexism, and then you have racism. That's the two sins there. And what's the sin in the middle that we're forgetting? We have Eve and Ham, and who is here in the middle missing?
It's Cain.
What was that? Cain. Cain, yes. So you have Cain here. So we go to Genesis, and at this time, racism hasn't yet come. And we're between the time of Eve and the time of Ham. And there's three particular sins. So Cain in the book of Genesis, we have Eve, then Cain, then Ham. So what was the sin of Cain?
Worship.
Cain says, I want to worship God the way I want to worship God. And what does it really matter? So we will paraphrase from Patriarchs and Prophets 80.3. From the middle of the paragraph, the children of Adam that remained loyal to God honored the Sabbath, but Cain and his descendants did not respect that day. They chose their own time for labor and for rest, regardless of Jehovah's express command. So Cain says, what does it matter what God says? I'll worship how I want and when I want. And the issue is worship and the Sabbath, or their version of the Sabbath. So you have three sins that bring on this degeneration. So in the restoration, there needs to be these three steps followed. 3, 2, 1. So you have Eve, Cain, and Ham, three sins. The result of Eve was sexism. God did not want that, and he did not institute that any more than he instituted racism. It's the inevitable result. So Eve was sexist. Eve, sexism was the consequence. Cain was a violation of the Sabbath. Ham was nationalism. So that was how we fell and degenerated away from God. And those same three early steps from the time of the end, from when we went from sea to land, God is undoing in reverse order. 3, 2, 1. Sexism, worship, and racism. Racism, worship, and sexism. So you have sexism, worship, and racism. Racism, worship, and sexism. So in the Alpha history, racism, we undo the sin of Ham, and then what comes after the sin of Ham? In the restoration. What's the next step in restoration?
Well, the Sabbath.
Right. In 1888. So you have the 1888 history here. The test is racism in the Millerite history, and the test is worship and the Sabbath in the 1888 history. If you go to the sin of Eve, there's no history after that. If God's people start tackling the subjects of gender, do you realize how close we are on a return journey? So here we are looking at gender, and what she's saying is it shows us how close we are on our journey, that we are now looking at the subject of gender.
I don't think we really understand that till its fullest extent, you know?
I agree.
I just don't think that we comprehend that.
I agree. But that's what, you know, it was in one of the prayers, I think, and I can't remember the thought came to my mind in there, and like always, thought goes in and goes out. But it's the lines that are teaching us. And it's not wrong to say, ask that the Holy Spirit would, I mean, we all do that, but the Holy Spirit is actually speaking through the methodology and through the lines. So I think sometimes, and I don't know if this is the same thing Donna's thinking, but we might be still so fixed on believing that God will lead us and forgetting, or I don't know if that's even the right word, but just not really fully grasping and allowing the lines to teach us. Because in looking at this, what Donna's saying is we don't fully grasp it, but the line says it clearly. And the line is actually telling us that that's how close we are. That this movement is, as she says, tackling the subjects of gender. As we study these subjects of gender and understand what's been shown to us now since this presentation, that God has no gender. The angels have no gender. And we see Jesus depicted as male and female and various, through different stories, different animals, different male, female, and understanding that to undo all our gender biases. And it's showing us that if that's the subject that we're not on the subject of racism, we're not on the subject of the Sabbath, we're on the subject of gender. And so we look at sin entered in rather quickly with sexism. And we're discussing that here. So that's telling us where we are on our journey. Another confirmation from the lines that this is the end.
That is so powerful. It's it brings to mind Brendan's study, and we have to really come to grips with our sin in our minds, because we can't take that to heaven. So we really have to understand this gender inequality, because it's so serious. And it is, I don't know, I don't want to say too much, but we just have to get it. We have to be done with it. We have to let go of whatever we're holding on to that will stop us from entering the kingdom of heaven. And this will.
When in particular, though, because the test is equality, right? But as we went through I can't even remember the title of the one that I just did. I'm always in the middle of transcribing some and making a PowerPoint for another and presenting one, so I get them all mixed up. But the one that we just did, we would see that it was Uganda, that's what it was, Uganda, where she was talking about her friend and how they wanted to believe that the reform vows are against God, because God is about freedom. And so we passed the test of equality, and so therefore we're saved. So when it comes to, and this goes back to that Portugal presentation, matter of being perfect, we're going to go to heaven, not altogether there. They weren't going to have everything understood here, because of sexism. Ellen White was, I don't know the right words that Elder Tess used, but Ellen White was talking about women teaching in schools, so that was beginning to open up, right? So then you have the issue of the Sabbath, but sexism isn't a part of that either. So these three things have to be restored, and this one is the one that is. So this is the test of this one. Equality is encompassing all, and sexism is the issue now, but with the reforms, with the vow reforms, because God is a God of order, and He does have rules, and so we may not be perfect when we go, but we have to pass and understand this and understand our vows, if that made sense.
Amen. That's true. And it just makes me think of what Tamina said in her studies on how, I think it's titled, How Do You Know You're a Sexist? And the point that I want to bring out that was valuable, and what she said, which many points she brought up is valuable, but that our test is on gender equality, and so in our studies, that should be our main focus of study, because when you want to pass a test, if you know that's going to be on the test, then you would want to make sure you understand it so that when the test comes, you can pass it. And I think that is just a so profound parable, because just like in regular school, when you know what's going to be on the test, you want to study for that, because if you're studying for all the other subjects and your teacher tells you this is what's going to be on the test, but yet you study all these other things, you know, when the test comes, you're not going to pass it because you were focusing on all those other subjects when your teacher told you that this is going to be the test for, you know, this exam coming up. I mean, for, you know, yeah, for this exam coming up. So, yeah, I just wanted to put that out there because it is important for us to have an understanding of our message, you know, but the present truth, you know, for our time is to really have an understanding of gender equality and what that is, and you know, and to be able to identify when there is gender inequality, to speak out against it.
Right. So I think this is the one where she talks about people, I think it's coming up, people saying, why do you talk about sexism all the time? And basically what you just said, sexism is the test and you're not ready. You need to study for this test. The test is not racism. The test is sexism. The test is equality, which encompasses all of this, but the test is sexism. And that's where the focus is. That's where the sin lies. That's where the test will be on sexism and gender. And that's what you need to understand. Because if we think we're going through with our same biases and our same idea of the male female gender stereotyping, then we're going to miss the point of what heaven is and heavenly citizens. And to miss that, I don't know if I'm wording this right, but to miss that is going to be to miss it here, and rightly understanding our work as well, and how can we go out and love people that we think are doing wrong when they're not doing wrong. It's us that has to rightly understand sexism and how deeply it penetrates each of us personally. So we're dealing with the results of sin, the sin of Eve. And you know what the problem is? People inside and outside Adventism, people inside and outside this movement, they love sin. They don't just love sin, they love what comes from sin. They love the results of sin. And if you love the results of sin and God takes you to heaven, what will happen?
No, the result of sin says they just don't love sin, or they don't just love sin. They love what comes from sin. They love the results of sin. And if you love the results of sin and God takes you to heaven, what will happen? So is this question, is this a question from the perspective of the sinner? Or is this question from the perspective of those who are not sinning?
Because she's talking about those inside and outside the movement, love sin, they love the results of it. Now, if you take it back to Eve anyways, and sexism, what was the result? Men,
right? Right. So the question, maybe I'm not phrasing the question properly. So is she talking when she says those, they, is she asking the question in the perspective of Eve, who sinned, or is she asking the question of Adam, who, well, he also sinned, but so
I think go ahead.
So okay, let's take Ham. So when she says they, is she talking to in the perspective of Ham or the perspective of Shem and Japheth. Because, I mean, what I'm seeing here, yes, both, but the people who feel superior are those who don't feel like they have sin. Those who are the result is those who feel like they're superior because they haven't sinned are the ones who are stepping on the necks of who they perceive as the sinners. If you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, so who's she talking about? All I know is she says people inside and outside Adventism, and then people inside and outside this movement. When you look at from the context of the subject of sexism, there are actually women that like their relationships with the man being in charge, and that's a very simplistic look at it. But when you look at the evangelical world, you know, that all that time during Trump presidency, I'm like, how can women actually, I realized, oh, okay, I view things different, because how can women actually think that that's okay to be talked to and talked about that way? But they are good little wifeys that do their duty as a wife and lift up and honor their husband. So there's those that love it. So I don't know if I have the answer to your question, because I think I understand your question a little bit better. But if you love the results of sin, so in other words, you know, if you take it to sexism, at least, if you love those results that, in the case of sexism, that man is superior, and whether you're male or female, and God takes you to heaven, what will happen? I mean, that's just in the context of sexism. So I don't know if I don't think I have the answer to your question, but I think I was understanding it better.
Susan writes in the chat that once we realize no one is superior to anyone else, we will be aligned to the understanding of equality. Sin allows them to be lifted up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
there
so-
are men,
Oh, go ahead.
there are men who will love sin in the context of their being the master of their home, etc.,
But there's
etc.
also women that like that construct, if that's the word to use.
Right. So the result of sin is the women saying, hey, it's okay for my neck to be stepped on because I'm the sinner. And also the men saying it's okay to step on women because they're the sinner.
I don't know, I'm trying to think that through in my head. Yeah, I try to explain that a little bit differently.
So the sin brought in warped thinking. So inequality on both sides, male and female, is good. Because the women say, I sinned, so I deserve to be stepped on. And the men says, it's okay for me to step on the woman because I'm superior. They're the ones who began this mess. So both sides have inequality in their mindset,
And like
and both sides are that they're okay.
right. So what happens if that's their mindset? What happens if God takes them to heaven?
They'll still be in that mindset.
Yeah. How does the Bible
There'll
say?
be sin in heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there'll be sin in heaven.
And I
Particular
don't think
earth.
God's gonna allow that.
There it starts all over again.
You guys are all saying it right, except for the verse that I have in my mind. Sin will rise up a second time.
Mhm.
It will not.
So if they go to heaven, if we still have sexism in us and we go to heaven, sin will rise up a second time. So Go ahead.
Elaine, I have a question though. What about people who died before that, before equality came as a test?
I think I don't know that I have the right answer to that, but I'm going to refer you as well to that Portugal study because, we know that God looks on the heart, and He knows that how He, when we talked about can He take a racist, how can He take a racist to heaven? How can He take someone that celebrates Christmas to heaven? Because they don't know any better, and He knows that if they did know better, they wouldn't do it. So leave that to the Lord, that if there's people that went to their grave sexist and didn't know any better, but God knows that if they did know better, they wouldn't be sexist. I think it, and I don't remember what presentations that might have been in that same area, but he did some talking about God taking a risk to take us to heaven.
Isn't that part of the job of the 144,000 to those that God did see fit to bring there? Wouldn't we be showing them the right little
Yes.
message on it?
Yeah, we'll be teaching.
I sure hope so, because I don't know who else.
That's I mean, you think of the scope of the work of the 144,000 is to teach Abraham, to teach Moses.
So with that, since we're going to be teaching, then you'd have to assume that there are going to be people who,
Sexist.
yeah, that have some
Yes.
extent do
Yes.
have a sexist mindset.
I definitely refer you guys back to the Portugal classes because he went through that in several classes. And I don't remember the titles, but maybe somebody finds it. But I think it's talking about, I don't remember if the title said it, but God takes a risk, something like that. I don't remember if that's in the title, but the risk that God takes in taking us to heaven, taking people to heaven. But somehow, some way, he says sin will not rise up a second time. And
Well, so to understand that, I suppose to understand that correctly, Paul was a sexist, died as a sexist, so he will rise as a sexist. And same with, our great fathers, Abraham, Moses.
yep.
They all
Adam.
died. They all died as a sexist, so they'll have to rise as a sexist.
Right.
But perhaps the sin. So there will be. I don't know if the sin will be in heaven. Okay, but perhaps because our heart is in the right direction, just like Paul. Okay, so if we take Paul as an example, when he persecuted the Christians, his heart was in the right direction because he really thought that he was doing it for God.
Right.
So his heart was in the right direction. And when he was corrected, he immediately turned 180 degrees. It wasn't, there's no, hemming and hawing. For Paul, it was, he immediately turned. So his persecution stopped. So maybe when the sin will not arise a second time, maybe there's the correct understanding is that there will be no stepping on the necks. There will be no persecution. There will be no blaming. There will be no shaming. There will be no condemning. Perhaps that's what it means when there'll be no sin in heaven.
Now, you understand the word. It won't, I never say it won't get there again in containment of a person. The key word, it won't rise again.
Maybe the 1,000 years is what we'll be, trying to work that out.
To be there and to rise is two different things. To be there, like you say, the ones that died into it, it's in them. When they go to heaven, it's still contained with them to be transferred with them, but it won't rise and spread out across heaven. Remember the key word, it won't rise again.
And also, too, I do believe that God knows those who are teachable.
Yes.
And like Elaine was saying, God has mercy on the ignorant. And so, there's people that just don't know the truth. But if they did, they would embrace it. but there's some people just didn't have the opportunity to know the truth.
You can see that right down here now with some Christians and Methodists. When they find out the truth, oh, I don't need to be doing that anymore. They stop right now. That's just on a worldly basis.
Okay. That's enough.
And to some extent, some of us have been that way with some of the things he's corrected us on, and some of us have been a little, we kind of drag our feet a little bit and unsure, and I got to check this out, or what have you. You know what I mean? And he's been bringing us along to where we have faith to believe him every step of the way, that we can react a lot quicker on the things he says. But think about it: if sexism is racism, the worship issue, and sexism were inequality, all equality is what all has to be restored, then wouldn't it only be that only us at the end would be in heaven? If that were the case, if they couldn't go to heaven because they went to their grave that way? Faithful human beings that lived up to the life they had would all be destroyed because they didn't live in this generation to understand the restoration?
Yeah, wow, that makes such perfect sense. Susan just chatted in that, that restoration continues in heaven.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and if we look back to how God dealt with Satan and Renee's definition, I guess, of what rising is. I mean, when sin entered into Satan's heart, God didn't, I don't know, that wasn't per se sin.
It developed though, right?
Right, it developed and it rose. And that's when God's forbearance stopped. When it rises, when it rose, it continued. So
it became a cancer that just spread.
Yeah, because I think there's somewhere also in Ellen White's writings that I guess, I think it was Ellen White in her writing, I don't know which one, that told Satan to turn back. It's not too late.
Yes. Yeah.
And had he listened and stopped, and it didn't rise, then everything would have been okay. Wow.
So how many of us thought we were going to go to heaven and learn from Enoch?
Well, yeah, I think we all did. I mean, never did we ever dream that we would be teaching. I mean, I still can't believe it myself, but
So there will be sexists in heaven, the ones that don't understand worship, and there will be racists in heaven. But had they known better, when they do know better, they won't do it. They'll understand how it hurts Jesus, how it put him on the cross, right? They'll understand that. And so anyways, I like the point that Renee brought up too, the rise up and how Phil expanded on that. So the end of ancient Israel, Jesus says to the disciples, I have many things to tell you, but you can't bear them. What they couldn't bear to hear, we are required to hear. What Jesus didn't dare say, this movement is required to speak. Just like the man of sin had to be revealed, other steps had to be taken before the second advent. So, we'll be teachers in heaven if we're faithful, if we understand our mission. So Eve's eyes were opened to understand the difference between good and evil. When she ate, her eyes were open. Too many people in this movement call patriarchy good. They call the dowry system good. They call culture good. Our eyes need to be open to understand the difference between good and evil. So I said that I would be presenting on issues I know are questions in this movement. And the thought that I see multiple times, sometimes said gently and sometimes with a bit more of a clear intention, I'm going to word what I hear people say. And there are different variations of how this is said. We are so tired of hearing you talk about gender and sexism. Talk about Black Lives Matter. Talk about racism. Talk about the Sabbath. We like hearing about those things. Why do you just keep repeating the same thing over and over again, which we just discussed? What Victoria brought up about the test. You have to study on what the test is. And if sexism is the test, then that's what you ought to be studying on. If racism isn't the test and sexism is, then why be studying racism? We know that it all encompasses equality, but this is the test. So sexism, sexism, sexism. I hope I am not misunderstood, but the underlying test of the Omega history, ours, is not racism. The underlying test is not Black Lives Matter. That was the alpha. We all know it's not Sabbath, but it's not racism. The test of the Sunday law will not be about racism. That was over 170 years ago. The issue in our dispensation, the center of our issue, is not the sin of Ham. It's also not the sin of Cain. It's Adam and Eve. We've gone virtually to the beginning. Remember, Eden to Eden, or A to end in A. We've gone virtually to the beginning, and that's why I won't stop talking about gender. That will be the Sunday law issue. So using this where you bend the curve, you had sexism, worship, and racism, racism, worship, and sexism. This is the Sunday law issue, sexism. Now we all know how the beginning and the end works. The beginning shows you what the end is going to look like. When it comes to our alpha history, the issue is racism. But God was still poking us along, sexism. Ellen White, first time God is going to use a woman in that kind of a role. First time we get a record of written inspiration from the hand of a woman. The issue is equality. The issue is sexism. But prior to 1989, there were these three movements. You had the first movement was the civil rights movement. The second was second wave feminism. And then the third was Stonewall. And these came prior to 1989. So it's equality. But we know at this time, it's sexism. It's equality for all. So these issues of gender were in our alpha history, in this alpha history. So I want to be clear, the issues of race are in our omega history. So sexism was here, but so is race here. They still exist externally and internally, but the test that divides the people of God at the end of the world will not be racism. If people still keep Sunday when they know better, God just moves on without them. If people are still racist, God just moves on without them. Now, that's not talking about the people that, in 1863, had he come back, then that there would be racists because they didn't understand the issue. Just like we were just discussing, there will be sexists raised up in heaven. But God knows that if they know better, they wouldn't be that way. So if people are still racist, God just moves on without them. This is not to ignore the consistent issue of nationalism inside this movement. But the issue of nationalism only became an issue in this movement once we started introducing the subject of gender. And people said, that's not what I relate to. That's not what my state taught me, my culture, my region, my tribe. All of a sudden, our nationalism came out. We wanted to stick with whatever our norm is in our nation. The core of the issue is gender. The Sunday law is gender. Now, people may ask, what about LGBTQ? Where does that come into the story? I want to move on. We don't have much time left. That's all gender. That's all an issue back in Eden. When we say racism, it is broad. It's nationalism that is universally pervasive. Sexism is broader than we realized. I don't want to go into the subject of LGBTQ today, but I do want to make the point that it's rooted in gender stereotypes. If you have a man and a man, what roles are they meant to fit into the family? She moves on from that. So when we say alpha racism and omega sexism, sexism encompasses not just the rights of women, it encompasses all the questions related to LGBTQ. We've only got through one of the 3 points, so we're going to move on to the next point. But keep sexism encompasses all the rights related as well to LGBTQ, gender and sexism. A story was shared in the media broadcast recently, and this was of the Yazidi women, Yazidi. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but when we were working on the Islam studies, we came across this group of people as well and went through these women and what had happened to them. So I'm just going to tell their story in brief. She did put an article, this was a while back, she put that article in the media broadcast. The Yazidi religion is quite unique. It's considered by external sources to be the oldest religion in the world. They don't allow converts, and it's deeply patriarchal. So we will paraphrase their story for those who haven't read it. What ISIS did to the Yazidi community, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but Yazidi community was essentially genocide. They slaughtered thousands of people. They captured the women and brought them into sexual slavery and forced marriage. So consider yourself as one of those women. Community slaughtered by ISIS, forced into marriage, into an ISIS fighter, and raped, finally liberated. So you've been forced into all that, and now you're liberated. And I'm thinking as I read this, that you go through stories in the Bible. I was thinking of David in particular, but I can't think of which battle it was. It was when David was joined up with the Philistines. All wrong that he did what he did, but I think it was when he was still on the run from Saul, and he pretended to be on the other side, if anybody remembers that. But you remember they went to where they were at, and I can't remember the Ziklag, was that what it was called? But where they were, David and all the people that were following him stayed, and while he was off with the Philistines, they came in and conquered the city, if I'm remembering the story right, and took all the women. Anyway, so in the battles, they would always take all the women, and it's just interesting to think that how that looks in a parable today because of the suffering that we see. Anyway, so they would capture the women, they'd bring them into sexual slavery and then forced marriage as well. So now consider yourself, this is what we want to put ourselves in the shoes of these women. Your whole community is slaughtered by ISIS. You're forced into marriage with an ISIS fighter and raped, and then now you're free. It's all over and now you're free. And the elders in their families and their communities, they all tell them, you can come back, but there's a problem. We're patriarchal. Those children that you had with ISIS men belong to the ISIS soldiers. They have the religion of their father. So your 6-month-old little girl is Muslim and we hate her father. She can't convert to the mother's religion because we don't allow converts. Because we're a patriarchy, she's born with her father's religion. And if you want to keep your little children, don't come back at all. So the freed women are given a choice: never be welcomed back to their own community, or leave their children behind, or bring their children with them and possibly see their children murdered. If you really put that in context of what kind of life is that, that is the life of many people in this world. This is just one example of no rights, no choice. You're in an environment where, I don't know if this particular environment, but I think it would be, think about where the women don't work. The women can't work. They're looking in the Bible times of the women couldn't make it without a man to support them. You have no right to go in. You don't have the rights that men have to do things. And here you are helpless. And you have now this choice, this decision to make. You're free now, but what are you going to do with that freedom? your own community won't allow your children to come back, what are you going to do? This was a story in the New York Times. Was somebody going to say something?
Yes, Elder Perminder, he has a study on choice, and I can't say it as he says it because he says it very subtly, but choice is really in this instance. In this instance, it says the women who are freed have a choice. But really, do they really have a choice?
Right.
They don't really have a choice.
Right.
Yeah, there's a study on that. It's very good.
Yeah.
Teaches you about what choice really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of choice is that when you don't come back or you don't come, if you come back, you can't have your children, can't bring your children. I mean, that's really no choice.
Right. Yep. For me, in the circumstances that I was in with an alcoholic husband, I already worked. I could just work and take care of my kids, but they don't have that ability. They don't have that freedom. They don't have that right, I guess you would say. I don't know if that's right. It depends on where you're at, what region you're maybe talking about. But, we see what's happening in Afghanistan. The women all ran and hid. Can't be out in public, can't work. They're totally dependent on someone else with no rights. So this was a story in the New York Times. So some of these women who have been captured by ISIS, fled ISIS, then taken back by their communities, leaving their children in orphanages. And then they fled their own families. They've gone back to those orphanages and grabbed their children, and they're waiting with hope that another country will take them in. My question is, where do you want to send them? To Switzerland that just banned head coverings? To Germany, Portugal, or Spain that are crumbling to the far right? And don't get me started on France. Where do you want to send them? You can say it will be better, but people come to the West expecting freedom, and they're surprised when they don't find it. The glorious land was supposed to be the land of freedom, the Declaration of Independence, and look what we've come to. And one more story, I want to talk about Korea. I'm going to quote from a Wikipedia page, Gender Inequality in South Korea. They have deep-rooted patriarchal ideologies, and South Korea is consistently ranked as one of the worst in the world for gender equality of any industrialized nation, especially when it comes to economy and politics, which is one word, power. During World War II, thousands of these Korean women were forced to become sexual slaves for the Japanese army, called comfort women. During the, I'm thinking back, I thought I had it bad with some of the experiences that I had. During the Korean War, I had nothing compared to what some women have had to deal with. During the Korean War, the United States enlisted more than 1 million, the United States, more than 1 million South Korean women into military prostitution. 1 million. And these weren't just sexual acts, this was violence. And the European Journal of Women's Studies, they discussed how the soldiers of lower rank, because they were subjected to harsh treatment from higher rank soldiers, not just sexual abuse, but open violence was their way of, I guess, preserving their masculinity. And what happened to women during those wars in Korea is believed to have impacted the equality those women could have today, what is expected of a modern woman in South Korea. It said that even a gender pay gap is the worst of any industrialized countries. We could do a whole presentation on their beauty standards, makeup, skin bleaching, plastic surgery, where they expected to not just look perfect, but also look pre-puberty. Whoops. So they are facing massive societal obstacles in their own country. The question is, where will you escape to? Where does everyone escape to? Where do they escape to?
You can't escape to anywhere.
Not anymore. The glorious land. Until a 21-year-old Southern Baptist, just like when you start a health kick and you're sick of eating junk food, you go to your pantry, you find all that junk and you throw it away so it doesn't tempt you anymore. And a young man with a sex addiction went to his pantry and slaughtered 4 South Korean women to remove his temptation. Where do you send them? This is the issue that I don't understand why people are not getting. People in Australia want to take to the streets and fight for women's rights in Australia. Social activism. I can do that. I have a right to be safe. But I could march that march and say, keep me safe from all those refugees, and know that it's the South Sudanese refugees that are viewed that way. I'm not questioning the fact that people march for good causes with good motivations. That was a civil rights movement, but there's no march for the Yazidi women. If we see this problem as universal as it is, do we realize our high calling? The message of equality, gender equality. You will see people from abuse, you will send people from abuse to abuse to abuse. Good external agencies just try to make sure that abuse is better abuse than the abuse they were already in. So it's not fixing the problem. I fear people in this movement do not see their calling. What we have is the opportunity to change the mind with the hope of eternity. And that's what he's been doing with us, is changing our mind, right? That we might have the opportunity to change the mind, the hope of eternity. And people seem to be leaving ministry positions with that thought that with a little bit of money, they can make the abuse less for the body. So like social activism and all of that, it's all well and good, but it's a higher calling. It's not just lessening the abuse. It's no longer tolerating the abuse and demonstrating that. I don't know how to say, maybe I don't know how to put it into words, but the heavenly calling, the God's way, and you have the mountain and you have the statue. They don't represent equality. True equality will be represented in this movement, God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. It's not going to be going from one great abuse to a lesser abuse. It's freedom. I would say that we don't get what this movement is about. Your heart aches and my heart aches, but if your solution is to go march, remember, one of the police officers kneeled during the Black Lives Matter protest, once said that we should put all those violent young Black men in concentration camps and let them die out. Everyone can kneel and be photographed, and nothing will change unless we address the cause. People ask, what do we do then? I've dealt with situations in this movement where a fellowship member attacks fellowship member, calling the other one, you're a conservative. No, you're a conservative. Sitting next to you, all around you today on this meeting are people who know abuse, possibly people you still have a chip on your shoulder about, that you at best just decided to ignore to focus on your life, your marriage, your future. Separating yourselves from women in your own fellowship, we've had a couple of years of this message to learn to nurture and care for each other. If you think your fellowship members irritate you, I'm not talking about the ones with doctrinal error. We deal with them. But where there are women leaders you can't respect. An older woman that you think just talks too much and is abrupt, or put you in the room with these Yazidi women and they will start to irritate you. Those 4 Korean women, you'll wash your hands of them soon enough. Don't ask what big work we can do outside when we've had 2 years where God has said, deal with the inside. And there's a mixture of apathy and infighting. If we can't handle each other inside, you wouldn't be a single use to the Yazidi women, because your goal should be to get them to heaven, true freedom. And the danger is you might find your neighbor, a Yazidi woman, more irritating than your fellowship member. So our goal is to get them to heaven, true freedom. It's the upper room. People now who want to do a big external work, I think unconsciously or not, they think that's easier, and it probably is. And God doesn't give us easy. I'd like to march and kneel. I'm too busy interacting with priests in this movement to meet their needs. If each one of us cannot do that, we would fail miserably externally, there is no safe place yet. If each one of us cannot do that, we would fail miserably externally. We'll summarize before we close. What I wanted to address in this presentation was point 3, how we manage external information, sharing Adventist material from outside this movement. That was my goal, but I didn't want to do that without going through point 1 and point 2. Point 1, the process of restoration. Our downfall was complete after 3 specific sins, Eve, Cain, and Ham. With the sin of Ham is a parallel to 1798, which should make people think the sin before the flood is a parable to the 1260. So the sin here is a parallel to the 1260. Something the likes of Jerry Falwell would never have been able to agree with. The time of the end, we retrace our steps back to physical restoration, walking with God in body, and finally, Eden restored. Eve's sin resulted in sexism, Cain's in a violation to the Sabbath, and Ham in racism and slavery. Time of the end, the first issue is racism and slavery, then the Sabbath and worship. Now is the issue of gender. The issues of nationalism are still present. God is still challenging us on nationalism. Therefore, he's attacking the Levites and the Nethinims on nationalism as well. But sexism was an internal and external issue in our Alpha history as well. Oberlin College, it was a turning point on education for Black people and for women. But the core of that issue was racism, 1850 and slavery. The core of our issue in the Omega history is sexism, which encompasses gender and LGBT issues, which is why neither of these subjects make people so uncomfortable as this one does. I came to the second point. If we have a message on equality, what do we do with it? What have we been told to do with it? The upper room. It's not social activism. This world is descending into the abuses of the 1260, this was a parallel. You will not reform it. So this abuse, that's the issues here. We are not going to reform these abuses. God has made it clear that our job description is to change who we can by changing the mind. And my point was that every single one of us have a sphere of influence and a work to do. And I see the fights on chat groups, the fellowships that distance each other. And my point was, if you want to fight with people in this movement, I hear people attack a woman and they think she's a conservative. She has conservative ideas. She doesn't practice equality. And I might know that she was raped when she was 15, and that's none of your business. But wouldn't it be nice if you knew the abuse the people around you had been through? That ministerially and doctrinally, we will stand in our lot. It does not mean we tolerate abuse from other people. But we've had a couple of years where we've been instructed to do that, and too little has been done to press together. I wanted to address that point before we go to the subject of sources, and we'll do that next time. I want to make one more point. If I've understood anything over the last couple of weeks, it's how I get twisted, misquoted, and Elder Parminder. Also, people put their own spin on things like principle and policy. People use the excuse of being a Christian and pressing together to overlook and excuse abuse. We don't do that, so please, on this issue, more than any other, do not misquote me. And that was the end. We'll go ahead and read the prayer and then have discussion. Dear Lord, we look with wonder at what you are attempting to do. We see that so many people love not just sin, but the results of it. They may not have enjoyed the fruit that Adam and Eve ate, but they love the sin and suffering that came from it. Isn't that somehow worse? I pray, Lord, that you'll open our eyes, that based on our cultures, our nationalism, our training, we will not attempt to call good evil and evil good. As we increasingly address the subject of homosexuality in this movement, may we see the seriousness of the tests that we face. These things are not meant to be easy. Our biases are so ingrained. I pray, Lord, that your work of restoration will be a success for every head bowed and our loved ones. May we do all within our power while calling out and not tolerating abuse in this movement. Restore those who are willing, but provide the right nurture and support to those who have faced abuse. To the real flesh and blood people facing violence and persecution in the time of trouble in our very midst, may we support. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. That was beautiful.
Nice.
Very mindful.
For learning.
Hopefully helpful. I found it helpful.
Yes, very.
But sexism, gender issues, we really need to understand, because those are the people that the message of freedom, I don't want to say it's the only people, but the message of freedom will go on either spectrum of it. I mean, look at what we just were discussing about Paul and Abraham and Moses and how they were all sexist and it's good to know. I do encourage everybody to review those Portugal, that one particular Portugal presentations, but then there are some others that we mentioned. And I'm slipping, my mind's slipping on the title of it. The one, I don't know if it was the title, but we were talking about one of the other topics, but they're really good presentations that, in particular the one, and I don't think the number 123, I don't think that was the one that showed the scale. He did that somewhere, maybe in that whole same section. I can't remember, but I remember specific, because I don't know, we probably all watched them all. But I remember that one specifically with that scale. He showed that scale, I think, or maybe it's not in Portugal that he showed it. I can't remember. He showed that scale in a camp meeting somewhere else. Maybe somebody remembers where last year. I can't remember. If somebody remembers it, post it in the chat, because he showed that scale. It might have been one of the Eden to Eden camp meetings where he showed that scale. But showing how much people knew in 1863, and then in 1888, and then in our history. And it just showed that a good part of what we are going to learn, we don't learn here, we learn in heaven. And so when we talk about the people that have already gone to their grave, sexists or racists, those that truly love the Lord didn't know any better. Once they learn, they won't want to do what they know is wrong, what they know is hurtful. And that's a big part of it, is they won't want to do what they know is hurtful. Anybody else?
Yeah, there's just so much persecution in the world. We don't want to add to that, you know. We want to ease the burdens of people's hearts, and with this message, you know, with this equality message. And it's just there's so much affliction and just so much people suffering, that we want to be a place of safety and comfort. You know?
A city of refuge, Donna and
Yes.
Susan.
Yes.
Susan put in the same time, we need to offer them a sanctuary, a city of refuge. That's what I've always kind of looked at it as. And as we continue to go forward, that's what I always kind of think of it as, is we're the city of refuge. And the Sabbath is the rest that they come into. But it's a city of refuge. And the second glorious land was supposed to be a place, a land of freedom. We were given the opportunity, given the time to be that haven for people in that freedom. But since you have all the sins that didn't get dealt with, the racism and worship and sexism, you have people in power with their necks on the or their feet on the necks of those that they believe they're superior to. How can you ever? And that's, to me, that's what I took it as too, is we're talking about they love the results of it. They like having their foot on the necks of people, that power, that superiority.
And it's a beautiful thing, just having a different attitude, you know, and having the right view of how God wants us to see people, you know, to not look at them any different, because that, when we do look at people differently, it does deepen the hurt, you know, like, you know, we can't help them if we're looking at them any different than us, if we're looking at them as inferior to us, you know. And a lot of it is dealing with the wrong information. And I think that is best, that should create empathy in our hearts to the fact that they just have the wrong information.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make them any inferior to us. It's just that they're doing things because of being a product of their environment.
Yeah. I pray to be ready. I pray my own self, you know, personally, to be ready to be that. Susan put that the Sabbath will be more than just a day. It will be true liberty. And that's kind of what I see it as too. It'll be the freedom. Freedom to rest.
Amen.
So anybody else?
Yeah, I wanted to say something, like referring to like, why do the women, you know, are accepting, you know, the dominant, the men taking that. I think one of the things is like that is more comfortable. Like, okay, let's just let them take care of it. They know what they're doing, and I'll just accept my role because that's what it was meant to be. I think it has become like an acceptable behavior to the point that is so like, it's so poisonous, but you just don't see it. And one of the biggest like that example of the Yadisi, I can't say the name of the group of women.
Yeah.
I think that's where we can like clearly see how the system of the men being the dominant, how they just screwed it all up, because they established that system, and we can see now with our own eyes how unjust it is and how bad it is for the women. And I am thinking now, like, okay, so how do I apply this now for here where I'm at, USA? What's going on right now? I recently heard of a case in Poland that they have abolished no abortion there at all. So this woman with a 5-month-old baby, there was something wrong with that baby, but the doctors, because of the law, they would not take that baby out of her. And so she died because they said, oh, until the heartbeat stops. Too late, she died. So now there's this protest over there because it's like, oh, so the woman doesn't have the right to choose. And even they said she was texting her mom how she was so desperate because she knew she was gonna die, and they weren't not, and they didn't take the child out of her. So I'm thinking, what I like all these rights that are being taken away from the women. It's like adding on, what do you call that? You're jumping from the frying pan onto the fire. And I didn't, sometimes like you don't think of the consequences of these rights that are being taken away, and how it just is going to affect, or is affecting, it's affecting each one of us. And the challenge that now we have to tell them, like, this is wrong, this is against God's law. You are an individual that have a right to choose. God gave you that choice to choose. And now you have men taking away that choice, all these laws that are oppressive. We're going back into the Inquisition times. And we got to stand up to the point where we have to, I think of myself, like I have to give up my life because nobody's gonna, not nobody, but hardly anybody's gonna agree with me, because they all have the conservative mindset. They're like, this is what God, see, that's what makes it even worse. Like, this is what God tells us. It's in the Bible. They're using the Bible as the authority to their wicked laws. So this is the challenge that we have now.
Yeah.
To
They lack-
overwrite everything.
They lack information, kind of like, when Moses went to his grave and Abraham went to his grave, not knowing anything about sexism, they lack information. Out there are God's people that, given the right information, they will get on the right side of the issue. And, and understanding, educating ourselves and educating people on the issues over abortion, they look at it as I don't know if singular is the right word to use, but they look at it with just the simplicity of thou shalt not kill, or maybe there are other things, but I mean, I'm in general, and you're going against God because you're killing. And yet the very same ones that are making the laws against are the ones that want to do nothing for the woman or the child when the child is born. And the men, the impregnator, he's not accountable at all. He just has the freedom to go off and impregnate someone else.
Yeah, that's why it's so chaotic. And even when you think about the literal sense of thou shalt not kill, you have to go beyond the physical being, because you're killing the woman's right to choose. You're liberating the male from his responsibility. Where's his choice is like, he doesn't have a choice. So it should be the woman that chooses, right? But no, she can't choose. So you're killing her right, her dignity to live the life that she wants to live. Okay, let's say she made a mistake, she got pregnant. Okay, well, too bad. Now you have to suffer and I have to keep this child. Okay, you don't want to keep it, you can give it up. Okay, who's going to raise this child? Who's going to be responsible for that child? That child might want to look for their parent. Like they're playing God, literally just playing God. And we have to like rip off that mask they have or whatever, because I know we have to educate people and give them information. But it's right now, I just feel like the war is getting tougher. And it seems like we have to just grab the sword and really, really use it as it needs to be. Because the way when you see the Supreme Court, like now it's neutral. Like really, the Supreme Court is like non-existent anymore. Like, why are they even there? They're not functioning. They're gonna leave the states to be responsible for making decisions. Like, it's just everything going so like really, really crazy, to the point that we really have to be warriors. And I mean, it's easier said than done, but I'm just thinking that that's really, we have to pick up God's sword with all our, we have to have faith to fight this fight.
Yeah.
Because it is terrible.
After lunch, maybe we'll pick up on some of that as well in the Isaiah study with the fight and what the fight looks like. Phil, were you going to say something before we go break for lunch?
Well, yes, there's much I wanted to say. Just a couple of quick points. I know we're into lunch. The woman who was caught in adultery, who they brought to Jesus to have her stoned, I'm seeing it as a whole different light now. Rather than her sin, more of her womanhood, the gender bias, the female being blamed.
Yeah.
So I see. I mean, that could be taken further than that. But I just want to put that out there.